About 30 years ago, boy, time flies by, doesn't it? About 30 years ago, I was living and working at a spiritual retreat, a spiritual community called Ananda Village. It's one of the most successful yoga and meditation communities in the world. And at that time, there was about 360 people living there, individuals, families. They had businesses in the community. People went out and worked outside the community. And I was an ordained unity minister at that point. I was ordained in 1993. But in 95, I went out there and lived. And I was on work exchange, where you work about 6 days a week, something like that. And in exchange, you get food, you get a place to stay. I lived in the corner of a trailer. And you get to take free classes there. So I got to take classes of Yogananda's teachings. And one of the things I did was a 30-day yoga postures training, where I was studying to be a yoga instructor. And part of the work exchange was doing a lot of different jobs, right? I swept floors, I cleaned toilets, I literally dug ditches and holes. And at one point, I was a cook apprentice. Yeah. And on this particular day, I was assigned to prepare a soup and dinner for 30 guests at the retreat. Now, the challenge is that I also was taking my yoga teacher training, and so during dinner, I actually had to demonstrate a yoga posture and then come back and finish cooking the dinner. So I was going to cook a soup, and a salad and toppings and all this stuff. So I started the soup, and I went to my friend Trish. I said, Trish, would you mind taking over while I go demonstrate the yoga posture, and I'll be back in a while. So I come back after the yoga posture, and it's about 45 minutes before dinner is to be served, and I taste the soup, and it is spicy. I mean, she laid on the cayenne pepper, like I don't know what. So next thing you know, I'm running around the kitchen, trying to finish the salad, toppings, and this and that. And one of the ladies from the yoga class sees me running around the kitchen around, I don't know, with 20 minutes left before dinner served. She said, do you need some help? I said, yeah, help me. So around 15 minutes before dinner served, I go and check my drop biscuits in the oven, and they're completely flat. Completely flat. Well, now that could be a little tense for somebody, right? 30 guests coming to show up. But I had a sudden, as all this craziness was going on, I had this epiphany where I realized, Justin, don't take it so seriously. You're the instrument, God is the doer, you're doing the best you can. Ultimately, God is in charge of whatever happens. So when I saw those biscuits, at that point, I started to sort of enjoy the craziness of it. And she came over and she looked at the drop biscuits that were now flat, and she said, let me taste one. She said, it tastes like a cracker. Why don't you just rename it? At that point, I was lightened up enough to be open to the idea. So at dinner time, the 30 guests come out, and all the food is laid out, the salad, the toppings, the dressings, the soup was now, the cayenne had burned off, so now it tasted decent. And then the bread was covered. So at the end of the blessing, I told them what we had for dinner, and then I unveiled the bread, and I pulled it off, and I said, and here is Virginia flatbread. And some of them tasted it and went, oh, that's good. They wanted the recipe for this. And then one of the older couples that used to cook there called me over, and I went over, and Ted whispered, he said, the biscuits didn't rise, did they? Oh, well, I always loved the saying of one of Yogananda's students, J. Donald Walters, who founded Ananda Village. He said, when something embarrassing happens to you, something difficult, eventually you're going to look back on it and you're going to laugh. So why wait? Right? Why wait? There's a Bible verse that says, in the heavens, he will laugh. Now that's not God sitting up on a cloud somewhere, or Jesus sitting on a cloud somewhere, laughing at us. That's a traditional, God's up there looking down and judging us. No. I like to look at that as having perspective on your life. When you are in a high place and you have a high perspective of yourself and of your life, then you can lighten up, right? Then you can take things a little less seriously. After all, we're only on this planet for a brief time, really, when you think about it, right? When you think of eternity and all the people who have gone before us, we're here for a very brief time. Are we enjoying ourselves? Are we enjoying our life? Or are we so stressed and tensed out about everything that we're not really enjoying ourselves? So many people think they enjoy themselves when they have a vacation, or they enjoy themselves on the weekend. They'll enjoy themselves. But every day is precious when we think about it, right? Every day is precious. Every day is a gift if we think of it that way, because it really is. It really is a gift. I mean, as we've said before, this planet is where everything's happening, right? Scientists don't see anything happening out there other than empty planets with, Mars with red dust and stuff like that. There's not much going on out there, and 99% of what we know. Now, maybe there's some UFOs or whatever flying around somewhere out there, but we're not seeing them yet. The party is happening here. All this stuff, life is happening here. And if you were born on this planet, you won the lottery. Right? There is no lottery big enough that can compensate for the fact that you won the lottery, because you are now here. You came down here on the planet. When we think about that, it can put things in perspective a little bit, right? That's what we're talking about. And if you want to talk about yoga philosophy, which is what I got interested in the beginning, is what they call the Jnana Yogi, the yoga of wisdom, where you use your intelligence to put your life in perspective, right? Rather than the personal mind. The personal mind is, I'm worried about this. I'm worried, did I say the right thing to her? I'm worried about how is this going to work out in my life? What's going to happen in that situation? We all do that to some degree, right? It happens. But how much do we stay there? That's the personal mind, me, my, and mine, right? Worried about ourselves. That's really what it is, me, my, and mine. As the late teacher Satchidananda said, where you have a lot of minds, you have a lot of minefields, right? Because you want certain things to happen, and they don't happen, and what happens? The natural reaction is anger. It didn't go the way I wanted it to. Or we set out appointments for things to work out the way we want them, and then they don't, so then you have disappointments, right? Appointments that don't happen. And how many of us know that happens in our life? Because it's just unpredictable. As Michael Singer says, the world wasn't designed to go exactly the way we want it to go. The world does what it does, right? The world happens the way it happens. But we have the privilege to be here and experience it. So we're where the party is. If we were on Mars or Venus or some other planet and a cockroach ran by, we would want to befriend that cockroach, because it's the only thing happening on that planet. You know, you wouldn't want to kill it. You'd be like, hey, hey, the only thing going on there. But here, we got a circus happening, right? Now, to put it into, use that part of our brain, our mind, to put it even bigger perspective, there are 1.3 million Earths can fit in the sun. 1.3 million Earths can fit in the sun. And there are 300 billion suns in our galaxy. 300 billion suns in our galaxy. And there are 2 trillion galaxies, each with 300 billion suns. See, when we use that part of our mind to put it in perspective, it's wow. And I'm worried about my coffee's cold. You know, I'm worried about, see, that's what happens. Jesus said, lose yourself to find yourself. Lose yourself to find yourself. Expand our consciousness to remind ourselves to lighten up. You know, what's going on in your life and in my life that maybe you're taking yourself a little too seriously? Can you think of something, some area or something in your life where you're maybe taking yourself a little too seriously? How can you lighten that up for yourself? How can you lighten up a little bit around that? Because I believe that what kinds of thoughts, what kind of beliefs can help you to feel more at peace? As we read in the Daily Word, where St. Paul talked about being in whatever circumstance I find myself, that's another interpretation, I've learned to be content. You know, how can you lighten up in some area of your life? Maybe it's thinking about, hey, I'm just happy I'm on the planet. I'm happy I'm here. Or, wow, I really am nothing in the whole scheme of things, right? Really, I'm nothing in the whole scheme of my life is nothing in the whole scheme of things. Ultimately, really. Napoleon Hill, who wrote Think and Grow Rich, he also wrote a book called Grow Rich Through Peace of Mind, which is a wonderful book. He wrote it in his later years, long after he wrote Think and Grow Rich. You know, he had interviewed 500 of the most successful people of his time, learned what were the success principles in their life. Well, many years later, he wrote this book. And in it, he tells a story. He says, you're important, but only for a little while. You're important, but only for a little while. And he talks about people who have this sense of self-importance. And even in his life, at one point, he felt like he needed 2 Rolls Royces. You know, he had 2 Rolls Royces, and he had his estate somewhere else, and this real sense of importance and superiority. But he realized that some of the greatest people who he knew, they had their life in perspective. Some of the wealthiest people they had their life in perspective. Not all of them, of course. Rockefeller didn't for many, many years. Only later in his life did he. But some of them, they recognized that in the grand scheme of things, they're not that important, right? They're not that important. One time, Napoleon Hill, at the time he was serving as President Woodrow Wilson's advisor. Never hear about that, right? He was one of his secret advisors. And he was about to go to bed, and then he felt guided to go to his typewriter and type something. He didn't know what. Remember the typewriter? You roll them in there. And all of it, he wouldn't know what he was going to type. And all of a sudden, into his mind, as if from another dimension, were the words, and he found himself typing it, 3 words, ultimately, nothing matters. Now, I shared this many years ago, and I had one person listening who didn't like me saying that. Ultimately, nothing matters. You know, it matters to us, it matters to the people in our lives, but from the biggest point of view, ultimately, nothing matters. Ultimately. And he was thinking about that. Oh, that's interesting. And he explained some incident that happened where he was writing a memo for Woodrow Wilson. It was during World War I and all that. Well, it turns out the war ended. He didn't even need the memo. And ultimately, he realized, ultimately nothing matters, really. And then Woodrow Wilson was trying to get Congress or whoever to do something with the League of Nations, and they weren't doing it. And back then, the same stuff. And Woodrow Wilson was so depressed and so bothered by it that he was gravely sick. Napoleon Hill knew why, because he had a broken heart. He was sorrowful. Others who were close to Woodrow Wilson knew why, because he was so distressed about they weren't listening to this great idea that could help the world and all that. And he was dying. And Napoleon Hill felt inspired to share with him after he was talking, and he's sitting there dying and talking about this. And Napoleon Hill says, well, President, ultimately nothing matters. And Woodrow Wilson said, you're absolutely right. And he felt like that gave him a sense of peace in his passing. Ultimately, nothing matters. It's not that big of a deal, right? If we could keep ourselves in perspective, perhaps we could lighten up a bit. Jesus said, let the children come unto me. Unless you are like them, you will in no way experience the kingdom of God. Right? Unless we have a spirit of a child that loves every day, don't they? When you're under the age of 5, you are just jumping up and down with, hey, what's going to happen today? I am alive, right? They can look at a grasshopper or play with a cricket for hours. They're just fascinated with life. They're trusting in the world, the universe, and they are alive with being alive. I've come that you may have life and have it more abundantly. That's not just having stuff. That's about divine life. That's about joy. That's about living now, living fully in our life. How many of you would like to live with greater joy in your life? Say aye. Aye. All right, at home, say aye. So that's what it's about, really. And if we could lighten up a little bit, what can you do? What area of your life where you're not really enjoying yourself? You're not really at peace. You're not content. Is there a way you can shift your belief system, your attitude, to lighten up some on that? Whether it's thinking about the thoughts we just said or some other way. Captain Darryl Coffey was a prisoner of war in Vietnam. And at one point he was in a rat-infested shower with rotting bandages on the floor, with garbage on the floor. And he looked up, and at eye level, etched into the wall by another POW, were the words, "Smile, you're on candid camera." Now, for those of you who don't remember Candid Camera, maybe you weren't around for Candid Camera, it was a show where they would catch people doing crazy stuff, that they set them up. They'd set them up, and it would be crazy, and then they tell you, you're on Candid Camera, and they go, oh my gosh. Well, at that moment, Coffee went from despair to having a little bit of lightness, and being uplifted by the fact that someone else could have the presence of mind to put those words in such a horrific situation. He who is in the heavens will laugh when we can get an elevated idea, perception of what's going on. It can lighten up the situation for us. This little boy was in a hospital for children with cancer. Some of you know about those hospitals. Maybe you've been to some. And he liked to make animal noises. Moo. Buck, 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 buck. Different animal sounds. And the nurses knew that about him. They're like, he's cute, that's fun. That's fun. He wasn't taking his situation so seriously. He was lightening things up. He was finding something to be silly, joyful in the moment. And he said, you know, I have cancer, but cancer doesn't have me. That's putting ourselves in perspective, isn't it? Things are not going to always go the way we want them to go. The world has changed, constant change. Stuff happens. The spiritual journey is not about manifesting your life to look the way you want it to look every moment of the day. I don't think it is. You know, there's writings that say, well, you have mixed results in your life because you have mixed thoughts. You know, because you have mixed thoughts and mixed beliefs, that's why everything's not perfect. Good luck with that. Good luck with having your thoughts always perfect and have everything going exactly the way you want it to go. I think that would be pretty boring, actually. Imagine if it went every way you wanted it to go, exactly the way you wanted it to go. You'd probably get sick of it, you know, literally. You'd just bored from it. That's not how life is. Life is what it is. And we are here to learn how to navigate in this world, to find joy, to find love, to find peace in the midst of our challenges. Jesus said, in the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. Jesus didn't overcome the world by escaping from it. Jesus didn't overcome the world by going up on a cloud somewhere. Jesus overcame the world by discovering his divinity. Jesus overcame the world by discovering the kingdom of God that was within him. He overcame the world by discovering, I and the Father are one. The joy that I have, you may have, and greater. You see, that's how he overcame the world. Jesus knew his connection and his relationship with his transcendent self. And he said, that which I do, you can do, and even greater. Follow thou me. So whatever challenges you have in your life, I invite you to continually surrender yourself to this greater power. To continually recognize that, you know what, I'm an instrument, God is the doer. He himself said, I of myself can do nothing. It's the Father within me who does the work. Jesus never took himself too seriously. Anyone would say, hey, good master. And Jesus said, why do you call me master? Why do you call me good? There's only one good, that's God. Jesus didn't take himself that seriously. He had a mission. He took God seriously. He took his guidance to live in that life seriously. But he himself, he didn't take himself too seriously. This morning as I was folding laundry and making my bed, changing the sheets, isn't that fun? Everybody loves changing. I was listening to a golf podcast. And I think I mentioned this in the habits. I was going to do this in the habits course we did to make it more pleasurable. And, you know, great podcast. A lot of it was on the mental side. And I'm writing a book on the mental side of golf and how you apply it to life also. It's just another aspect of what I do. And I thought to myself, God, these guys are really smart. They really know their stuff. And they've got a podcast that could fill Madison Square Garden with the number of listeners. And I thought to myself, gee, I could have done a podcast and started a podcast, and I could have thousands of listeners too on my golf pod. And I started feeling sad about it. This morning, I started feeling sad about it. Well, I could have done that, and I didn't do it, and my information is good or better than what they're talking about. But whatever. So I felt sad about that. And then I remembered something. One time when I was in meditation, I thought to myself, I am completely happy and content within myself. I'm completely happy and content within myself. And I heard what seemed like a voice say to me, you can't do any better than that. You can't do any better than that. And I felt my spirit begin to feel more peaceful as I reminded myself that ultimately the best thing that any of us can do or achieve on this planet is not to wow people with whatever we do. It's to raise our consciousness. It's to be a being of peace and love and joy on the planet. That's how we can really make a contribution. As the great yogi sages talk about when they talk about karma yoga, it's not helping with the dishes at the retreat and all that. If you've been to a yoga retreat, they're like, it's karma yoga time, you help volunteer to do stuff. It's the consciousness with which you do it. And life ultimately is about our consciousness. We can't take anything with us except ourselves. And the consciousness we have now and the consciousness we have when we leave, that's ultimately all that really does matter. And each of us, no matter what you do in your life, no matter where you are in your life, whether it's a challenging relationship, whether it's a struggle in work or job or a health challenge, no matter what you're facing in your life, you can work directly on your consciousness. And you can discover more of the Spirit of God within you, the joy, the peace that transcends everything else. You and I can take ourselves less seriously and lighten up a little bit and enjoy the gift of being alive and the gift of cultivating that relationship with our Creator.